Yes? Hello. Do you have approximately 31 minutes to talk about forests? I'm sorry, who are you? And how did you get in here? Did you know that forests actually store more carbon below the soil than above? Isn't that fascinating? No. Sounds kind of boring if I'm honest. You're so funny. Prepare to be educated. Forests have something to do with climate change. But what? And why should you care? In this video, we'll try to understand why CO2 flows into forests and back out of them. And while doing that, we'll touch on topics that are absolutely indispensable if you don't just want to know about climate change, but really understand it. So, let's dive in. Part 1. Carbon sources and carbon sinks. Did you know there's actually two different types of carbon emissions? We'll get to that in a second. But let's firstly start with a very short summary of the current situation, so that we're all on the same page. Around 200 years ago, humans slowly began doing things that emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And nowadays, we're emitting more each year than ever before. As a result, the CO2 concentration in our atmosphere keeps rising. And that's a problem, because CO2 causes a greenhouse effect in the atmosphere and the planet gets warmer. In total, we've already emitted 2.6 trillion tons of CO2. Most of it is because we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil or natural gas. That's the gray block right here. A much smaller part of emissions comes from another source, that little yellow block right there, which is called land use change. Land use change means that humans turn one type of land into another. Examples could be turning a piece of grassland into a paved city, or cutting down a forest to grow crops in its place. Especially in the earlier stages of the Industrial Revolution, land use change made up the majority of the emissions. But nowadays, fossil fuel emissions have risen so much that land use change emissions seem rather small in comparison. If you're now wondering how exactly land use change can lead to CO2 emissions, don't worry about it. It's not really important right now, so we'll come back to it later in the video. Let's focus on something else first, because there's something strange going on in this graph. If we look at all the CO2 that we've emitted since 1850 and then compare that with how much the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has increased, we can see a quite significant gap. We seem to have lost some CO2. Where did it go? We can find the answer to that question in something called a carbon budget. It reveals that the rest of the CO2 either went into the ocean or was absorbed by the land. We call that the ocean sink and the land sink. The word carbon sink means something that absorbs or takes CO2, and it's the opposite of a carbon source, something that emits CO2. To put it simply, the left side shows us where the CO2 is coming from, fossil fuels and land use change, while the right side shows us where the CO2 that we emit is going. Naturally, both columns should be the same size. This same size thing becomes clearer when we look at a carbon budget that includes the development over time. As the CO2 emissions kept rising, the carbon sinks necessarily also increased. Oh shit. Hey buddy! I thought we agreed that we were gonna talk about forests today. I didn't think I would need to remind you again. Oh, no, totally, man. We will. It's just that we're building up to that part. You have to begin with the basics first, or it gets confusing. Like roots. We're building up from the roots towards the actual tree. I see. Only strong roots can support a glorious crown. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Please continue. Okay. Phew. Sorry about that. As we go further, we will see that forests play a big role for CO2 emissions from the land use change sector, but they're also the main contributors to the land sink. Forests can emit or absorb carbon dioxide depending on the situation. And to really understand why that is, we now need to talk about the carbon cycle. Part 2. The carbon cycle. When we talk about carbon in day-to-day life, we're mostly talking about fossil fuels. But it's not just in fossil fuels. Carbon is everywhere, and it's a part of many different chemical structures. In our atmosphere, it exists in the form of carbon dioxide or methane. Carbon dioxide can also dissolve in the ocean, where it turns into carbonate or bicarbonate. And most importantly, carbon atoms are the main building block of life. Humans, animals, plants, indeed all living things are made out of carbon compounds. And of course, this goes for trees as well. Let's ask ourselves a question. From where does a tree get the carbon that it is made out of? You might remember from biology class that trees, and all plants for that matter, absorb CO2 from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. A tree takes CO2 out of the air and transforms it into cellulose or lignin or all kinds of other carbon compounds that are found inside trees. This also answers the question from earlier. What does it mean when the land takes up carbon dioxide? The answer is simply that the CO2 was turned into plants. What we can learn from this example is that carbon can move from place to place, and it can even react and transform into different stuff. This is a natural phenomenon that we call the carbon cycle, and it includes everything across the land, the ocean, and the atmosphere. And for the last 150 years or so, humans have interfered with this natural movement of carbon. By burning massive amounts of fossil fuels and blasting all of that CO2 into the atmosphere, we're introducing a lot of additional carbon into the cycle. And even though we're emitting it into the atmosphere, it's not really contained inside the atmosphere. Due to the nature of the carbon cycle, it goes everywhere. It cycles around. Let's reflect for a moment on what we've learned. Out of all the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere, only some of it actually remains in the atmosphere due to the ocean sink and the land sink. To say it simply, we want these sinks to absorb as much of our emissions as possible, so that the atmosphere retains as little carbon as possible. Because that's where the greenhouse effect that causes global warming occurs. The question whether these carbon sinks will continue to absorb a significant part of our emissions, or if they could somehow lose their effectiveness, is hugely relevant to global warming predictions. And if we want to evaluate if the land sink is doing well, we need to ask, are forests doing well? Because forests make up 2/3 of the land sink. They're by far the biggest part. So, when does a forest take up carbon? And when does it stop absorbing anything? Can it re-emit the carbon that it absorbed in the past? And what does human land use change have to do with it? It's time that we talk about forest carbon storage. Part 3. Forest carbon storage. As we've established, trees get their carbon from the CO2 in the atmosphere. As a tree grows, it sucks CO2 out of the air and uses that to build itself up. So if a tree contains 10 tons of carbon, we know that it must have taken 10 tons of carbon out of the air during its lifetime. But when the tree dies, It decomposes and its carbon is released back into the atmosphere in the form of CO2 and methane. Let's look at what happens if we have a whole forest, not just a single tree. In the beginning, a freshly planted forest will grow quite quickly because the trees are still young and there's lots of space to grow into. But as it grows older and bigger, growth slows down. It can take 50 to 200 years for it to reach its final size, also called its mature state. By the way, in Europe where I live, there are very little of these old-growth forests left. Most of the forests here are regrowing from having recently been cut down. Other countries such as Brazil, Canada or Russia, on the other hand, still have vast areas of old-growth forests. In a simplified model of how these old-growth forests behave, it is said that they are in a state of equilibrium, where young trees grow at the same rate as old trees die and decompose, meaning that they don't take up any additional CO2. So, in theory, a mature forest contributes nothing to the land sink because it's not growing anymore. Let that sink in for a moment, because it is important. According to the simplified model, only young, growing forests contribute to the land sink, while old forests are basically useless because they don't take up any more CO2. One could almost say that old forests are just trash. What the hell did you just say to me? Trash? Basically useless? Say that to my face, I dare you. No, I didn't mean it like that. Of course I know that old-growth forests are very important. I was just doing a thing with the audience where I'm explaining a certain way of thinking, only to then point out why that way of thinking is wrong. Why old-growth forests are actually very important. Oh, I see. Well, try to be more careful with your language next time. Words can sometimes sting more than an axe to the trunk. Okay, I'm sorry. I'll try to do better next time, I promise. Now, I'm already going to give you a small spoiler for the next chapter, where we will see why this simplified model no longer holds up. But that comes later. Firstly, we will explore why mature forests are quite far from being useless, even if we assume that they don't take up any more CO2. To do that, let's now confront some devil's advocate examples to help us understand. What if we've got an old-growth forest? Should we cut down those trees and use them for firewood? Now, some handsome devil might come along and say something like, "Who cares if we use that wood to heat our homes? That forest wasn't taking up more carbon anyway." Well, true, but what about all the old carbon that it took up over its lifetime? By burning the wood, you're releasing it all back into the atmosphere, when it didn't have to go there. The carbon was stored kind of safely in the forest. Okay, I get it, no burning the wood then. But why don't we simply cut it down for timber so we can build furniture and wooden houses? The carbon would be stored safely inside those wood products. And we could even plant a new forest that will take up additional carbon, unlike the old forest that was there before. You cannot tell me that this isn't a great plan. That does sound pretty good actually. But we're still missing some crucial components that we need to consider. First of all, is the carbon really stored that safely inside those wood products? Particle board furniture, for example, is designed to be very disposable and on average lasts for only 10 years before it's thrown away and burned, and a new piece has to be bought. Solid wood furniture, on the other hand, can be used for many decades or even generations. It can be repaired or reused as a second-hand item. This approach is not only resource-friendly, but it also ensures that the carbon inside the wood is kept out of the atmosphere for as long as possible. And secondly, this schematic conceals something very important. In mature forests, the trees actually make up less than half of the total carbon storage. More than half of the carbon is stored underground in the soil, where living and dead organic matter have built up over decades or even centuries. And you can't simply cut down all the trees and then expect the soil carbon to just stay there. A mature forest is a complex ecosystem with closely interacting parts of microorganisms, different plants and animals. If you remove the trees, this delicate balance is disrupted and the soil can no longer hold all the carbon that has built up over time. It gets released into the atmosphere as CO2 or methane. And when you plant a new forest in the same place, the carbon lost from the soil doesn't magically come back. And neither does the rich biodiversity that lived there. Both of them could take centuries to fully recover. By the way, the draining of swamps and peatlands is bad for the same reason. Much of the carbon in the soil gets released into the atmosphere. So, paradoxically, if you want to harvest firewood or timber, you shouldn't do it in old-growth forests, but rather in younger forests that are under human management. The fact that younger forests are still growing means that they can recover much more easily after you remove some trees. Of course, you have to be careful with it. Rather than clear-cutting all at once, you can cut down only a small fraction of the trees periodically, which allows the forest to maintain a certain level of biodiversity and to grow its carbon storage underground. All that while timber is being produced. Strategies like these are sometimes called improved or sustainable forest management. The main advantage of this more sustainable forest management is the fact that the forest is never completely gone. This means that the important forest functions can always continue. And those forest functions go far beyond simply storing carbon. A forest's root system stabilizes the soil against landslides or avalanches, while the above-ground canopy and underbrush protect the surface against wind erosion. Additionally, forests can absorb rainwater like a big sponge, which not only slowly filters and releases it into the groundwater, but also protects cities from flash floods. And as if that wasn't enough, they even act as natural air filters, removing particulate matter and pollutants from the air. If you harvest the wood from a forest by clear-cutting it all at once, all these valuable forest functions are gone as well. We've covered a lot of ground in this video, but so far it's all been kind of theoretical. Therefore, in this last chapter of the video, it's time that we finally talk about some real-world events. Stuff that is actually happening right now. Part 4. What's happening with forests right now? Oh hi! Have you heard of this thing called climate change? It affects forests as well. Droughts, forest fires and outbreaks of bark beetles are all becoming more common due to climate change. Forests that are affected by these disturbances turn from carbon sinks into carbon sources. They lose some of their carbon stock and start emitting CO2 into the atmosphere. But surprisingly, despite those increasingly common disturbances, forests in all climate zones have on average grown denser, not thinner. Can you guess why? The reason, ironically, is the increasing CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. The more CO2 is in the air, the easier it is for plants to take it. This also adds additional weight to the argument from earlier about how it's not good to cut down old-growth forests. In an atmosphere with a rising CO2 concentration, such as ours, even mature forests can keep growing and are continuously taking up CO2. We already saw this in a different form earlier in the video, when we looked at the carbon budget. As we kept emitting more CO2, plants began growing faster and faster. It is important to stress, though, that this trend could very easily turn around. Even now, the negative effects of droughts and forest fires are barely counteracted by the effect of CO2 fertilization. As temperatures continue to increase, droughts and forest fires will turn ever larger areas from carbon sinks into carbon sources. This largely depends on how warm it's actually gonna get before we, do something about it. But even now, increased carbon density of forests is great, but it's not worth very much when we're reducing the total forest area year by year. Especially tropical rainforests are being deforested at staggering rates, and total emissions from deforestation recently averaged around 6.2 billion tons of CO2 every year. By the way, we categorize these emissions under the land use change sector that we saw earlier. Because deforestation of tropical rainforests contributes so much to our total CO2 emissions, we will now discuss the two most prominent examples. The first example is the tropical rainforest in Indonesia and Malaysia, where vast areas are being cleared by logging or burning to produce palm oil. Palm oil is consumed in massive amounts all over the world. 80 million tons of it are being used every year, mainly in the food industry, but also for cosmetics and cleaning products. Despite its association with deforestation, a loss of biodiversity and human rights violations, many environmental organizations believe that a palm oil boycott would not solve the problem. This is because palm oil production is incredibly space efficient. If you wanted to produce the same amount of oil from a different plant, you'd need an area between 4 and 10 times larger. So, switching to another plant oil could unintentionally lead to more deforestation in entirely new places. A better strategy would be to ensure that palm oil can be produced sustainably without additional deforestation. This could be accomplished by a combination of strategies. Palm oil exporting as well as importing countries could put stronger regulations in place to ensure that palm oil production can continue without new deforestation and with stronger human rights protections. Public pressure towards companies should not aim to stop them from using palm oil, but rather to scrutinize how they get that palm oil. What measures did they take to ensure appropriate environmental and human rights protections? What certification, if any, does their palm oil have? Are they sufficiently transparent about their supply chains? I know this answer is unsatisfying, but what can I say? Sometimes shit's complicated. Another place where large-scale deforestation occurs is the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. A whopping 20% of it has already been destroyed in the past 50 years. The number one driver of this deforestation is to create land for cattle ranching. That means a feeding ground for cows. Another driver is the production of soy, which is also used mainly for animal feed. In the case of the Amazon, we can clearly see that our dependence on animal products is the cause of this deforestation. There is also a more general point to be made about the connection between deforestation and animal products, their inefficiency. For example, to create only 1 kilogram of beef requires up to 25 kilograms of animal feed. This means that we need a lot of space for agricultural area when we produce animal products, and already now 75% of our agricultural area is used to produce animal feed. And the more agricultural area we need, the more that creates an economic pressure towards deforestation. You can spot the two regions that we talked about pretty clearly on this map that shows which forests are absorbing carbon, that's shown in green, and which forests are emitting carbon, that's shown in pink. Here's the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, and here are Indonesia and Malaysia. Let us now finally get to the centerpiece of this video, the big picture. How important are forests exactly? What percentage of our CO2 emissions are caused by deforestation? And what percentage of the land sink is due to forest carbon uptake? To answer these questions, let's look at the carbon budget once again. This time, we'll only look at the last 10 years to get a more accurate impression of what's happening currently. Here we have emissions from fossil fuels, and here we have gross emissions from land use change. Of our total emissions, this much is taken up by the ocean, this much by the land, and this much goes into the atmosphere where it causes a greenhouse effect. Let's start with land use change emissions. 75% of gross land use change emissions are caused by deforestation. That's equivalent to 14% of all CO2 emissions. In the smaller part are emissions from land use change that don't involve forests, like draining swamps, for example. Now let's look at the land sink. Of the total land sink, about 2/3 are done by forests. That's enough to compensate 28% of all CO2 emissions, or to compensate 37% of our emissions from fossil fuels. Surprisingly, human-made forest projects and regrowing forests make up almost half of the forest carbon uptake. Much of this human-made carbon sink is actually in the same tropical rainforests in which a lot of the deforestation occurs. Some of the abandoned agricultural areas are being reforested and are recovering with surprising success. Another prominent example of a human-made forest carbon sink is China's Great Green Wall project, an afforestation project to prevent the expansion of the Gobi Desert. Going back to this graph, we can clearly see that forests are the main contributor to both the land sink and to land use change emissions. They play a huge role in climate change. But forests have actually grown less important than they used to be 30 years ago. Because while fossil fuel emissions have been growing and the total land sink has also been growing, forest carbon uptake has actually stayed the same in the last 30 years. Part of the reason why we didn't see an increase might be because the total forest area has declined by 5% during that time. We have less forest area now than we used to. Otherwise, the forest carbon uptake might have increased similarly to other biomes. This shows us something very important. Deforestation is not only directly emitting significant amounts of CO2, but also indirectly preventing future CO2 uptake. Speaking of future CO2 uptake, we're almost at the end of the video and I've got to mention one last thing. A topic that could honestly fill another half hour easily. And that is that basically all climate scenarios rely on us massively expanding the total forest area in order to pull more CO2 out of the atmosphere and even reach net negative emissions in the far future. An entire field of research is growing around forest-based CO2 removal. In this vein, many researchers have recently criticized the tendency of afforestation projects to be reduced to a single number, the amount of CO2 they can absorb, when this is far from the only important metric. With a video like this one that focuses on carbon dioxide and forest carbon uptake, I could easily be making that exact mistake. A great example to illustrate this point is the Great Green Wall project of the African Union that was originally conceived as a way to stop the expansion of the Sahara Desert by building a wall of forests. The idea has since evolved into a broader project of restoring degraded lands into functioning and productive ecosystems. The purpose of such projects can hardly be reduced to only capturing CO2. And it would be a great mistake to neglect equally important forest functions in our pursuit to pull CO2 out of the air. Forests can be many things and do many things. Sometimes a forest isn't just a forest, but a home to an entire community. And as we're currently living inside a mass extinction event, forests can be a haven of biodiversity. Forests can be recreational areas to take walks in, and they can be sustainably managed to produce timber. Their root systems protect the soil from erosion, they stabilize the water cycle, and filter pollutants out of the air. Honestly, forests will be my new favorite thing for at least a couple of weeks. Or until I jump down the next research rabbit hole. And I hope I was able to infect you with some of my newly found enthusiasm for forests. In any case, I really hope you liked the video. I spent so much time researching and making it, honestly much more time than I thought I'd need. And I'm interested in what you guys think. Write your feedback down in the comments. I'm especially curious whether you found it too easy or too complicated. And if you have an idea which topic I should cover next, I'd be happy about the suggestions. Until then, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Bye bye.